The following episode is presented by Officers Christian Fellowship. The views expressed by the host and guests of OCF Crosspoint don't necessarily reflect the official policies and views of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. For more information about OCF, visit us online at ocfusa.org or follow us on Instagram and Facebook at OCFUSA.
Everyone has a story to tell.
Stories of hardship, stories of hope,
stories of doubt, stories of faith.
But no matter the story,
these diverse experiences of military life
can all be found at the intersection of faith, family, and profession.
This is OCF Crosspoint.
Hi friends, it's Josh Jackson, Director of Communications at OCF and host of the OCF Crosspoint podcast. So, after an extended break, we're back with a new episode. And in fact, we're working on several new episodes right now. Before I share with you my interview with today's guest, Major Chris Reardon, United States Marine Corps, I want to get a couple of housekeeping items, if you will, out of the way first. Okay, number one, we're always looking for guests to come on the show and share their story with us. Now, in the past, I've always asked listeners to send an email to me at podcast@ocfusa.org. And you can certainly still do that, but I'd like to tell you about a new page we have on the OCF website that might make the process a little bit easier for you. Just go online to ocfusa.org/podcastguest, and that's all one word, podcast guest. And on that page, you're going to see a few things. You're going to see, in general, what it is we're looking for from a guest. You'll also see a section that has a list of topics. And the reason why that list of topics is there is because in the past, we found that there are some guests who would rather share their story around the topic, or rather focus their story with one or two topics in mind. And so this list of topics is intended to aid someone in doing that. And then finally, there's a section where you just submit your basic information to us, who you are, what topics you've selected, in general, what your story is about, and that sort of thing. So again, I encourage you to go online. If you would like to share your story, if you know someone that needs to share their story, go online to ocfusa.org/podcastguest. And the second item is a request. If you like the podcast, please tell other people about it. You see, back in February, I got together with a small group of people, sort of an informal podcast review team. And one of the things that I found out from this group is that when it came to finding out about the OCF Crosspoint podcast, a lot of them found out about the podcast in one of two ways. First, someone either told them about the podcast, or second, they were on Google or in their favorite podcast app searching for podcasts and came across the OCF Crosspoint podcast that way. So again, if this is a podcast that you think others need to hear, please spread the word, tell them about the podcast, and if you would, also tell them why you like the podcast. Why are you recommending it? What do you like about it? And that sort of thing. And of course, as always, if you have ideas, if you have suggestions, you can still send an email to me at podcast@ocfusa.org. All right, now that the housekeeping items are out of the way, let me tell you briefly about what's coming up. As I mentioned a moment ago, I interviewed Major Chris Reardon, United States Marine Corps. We had a great conversation. One of the key takeaways, for me at least, as I was interviewing Chris, is how he talked about integrating faith and profession. And I realized for some people that can be perhaps a little ambiguous. What exactly does that mean to integrate faith and profession? And Chris does a good job of unpacking what that looks like for him and sharing some practical application that I think you guys will also find useful as well. And one of the other things that Chris talks about is his business. Well, technically, I think it's a nonprofit, but it's called Freedom Fitness America. And Chris talks about how God put it on his heart to use this business, this fusion of fitness and faith, as a means of integrating his faith and profession. So be sure to take a look at the show notes. There's all sorts of links about how you can find out more about Freedom Fitness America. Okay, let's jump into my conversation with Major Chris Reardon, United States Marine Corps, as he shares his story of military life at the intersection of faith, family, and profession.
So a little bit about me. I'm originally from Waterbury, Connecticut, where I grew up. I'm the middle son of 3 boys, triplets actually. We're fraternal triplets. And when I was a young man, I had wanted to join the military. I actually used to want to be an astronaut. I was really a big fan of Neil Armstrong and was thinking I was going to be a Navy fighter pilot after I saw the movie Top Gun. And then after I saw that movie, I was in 8th grade. I had kind of mapped out what my future was going to be. I was going to basically, follow Neil Armstrong's footsteps and was going to be a Navy fighter pilot flying F-14 Tomcats, was going to go to eventually be an astronaut, and maybe I was going to be the first man to land on Mars, something like that. It was just kind of like a childhood type of dream. That was kind of naive, to be quite honest. But in terms of the military at that time, the only thing I really knew much about it was I had family who had served in the World War II generation. I had an uncle serve in Vietnam. But to be quite honest, my dad especially was not keen on me joining the military. He had grown up in the Vietnam War era. He was in trade school, saw a lot of his friends who had died in battle. He had just missed a draft. And so he wasn't supportive of it initially. And then when it came to my other family members, they had a similar feeling too, because they felt the military was something for, what you could do when you don't have other prospects like going to college. And well, my mom went to 2 years of college. My dad went to 1 year, about 9 months of school, but he, ended up dropping out. He was more on the trade side. But my parents wanted me and my brothers to go to college. That was one of their dreams. And for the next generation, that was like just seen as a way of improving our lot in life, if you will. But in 8th grade, I was a very smart kid. I was valedictorian of my 8th grade class. And I went to the guidance counselor and was telling him kind of what I was thinking about doing. And he said, you should go check out this Marine Corps JROTC program in the high school next door. So I said, okay. So I ended up meeting First Sergeant Henry Lee Weber. He was retired First Sergeant in the Marine Corps. And, was talking a little about what I wanted to do. And he just handed me this catalog for the U.S. Naval Academy. And that was the first time I actually understood that I could be a naval officer, whether it be in the Navy or Marine Corps. I could go to college. And my family didn't have the money for me to go to college. We were a middle-class family with 3 boys. There was no chance of us getting funds. And so this idea of being able to go to a service academy, go in the military, it was awesome. It was eye-opening that summer. This is in 1999. And really, it became my dream all of a sudden, where I was going to basically go to the Naval Academy. I ended up joining Marine Corps JRTC, decided I really want to be part of the Marine Corps now. And then I decided didn't want to really be a pilot anymore. I wanted to go on the ground side. Still had a kind of like a love for aviation and everything, but I really fell in love with this idea of leading Marines in combat. I watched a lot of movies when I was a kid, such as like Saving Private Ryan, the Band of Brothers, We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson. And I really was drawn to the idea of like this idea of combat leadership, the idea of like being, the first in, taking the lumps with your guys, and that was in Boy Scouts as well. I was surrounded by leaders. One of my, the troop chaplains, he was a World War II veteran in the Navy, had a Scout Master who had served in the Cold War era of the Navy and then later in the National Guard. So all this was influencing me. Now, from a spiritual perspective, I grew up Roman Catholic, but my church, when I was growing up, all I really knew about God, I went to CCD classes, which is for the Protestant community, more like a Sunday school type thing. But I didn't honestly learn a lot. Like, it was just, there was a few principles here and there. I just remember the kids always being obnoxious, and we would just shepherd in for like an hour of class, then we go to church service, we do our thing. I got my Holy Communion, confirmation, and then I didn't have to do Sunday school once I got to 9th grade. I was an altar boy. So I had a desire to serve God, but nobody ever really taught me about what it meant to have this deep relationship with Christ. So really there's this parallel universe of 3 things of like my family life, dealing with the hardships of growing up, being a middle child, 3 boys, men in my family, they're very macho. I grew up, between military or like the police officers, like my grandfather was a police officer. And I kind of felt like a little bit of a weak guy. And I was struggling with this idea of like, I go to church and I hear about Jesus, who's kind of like this meek guy who was just turning the other cheek and I don't know, like don't kill anybody. So that was like what I'm hearing. And then I'm seeing this other aspect of when I'm growing up, and that wasn't jiving. So that's kind of the things I'm dealing with personally. Trying to figure out who I am as a young teenager, and this idea of now I'm going to go in the military, go to the Naval Academy. I was fortunate that Mr. Krill, who was a science teacher of mine, he asked me where I wanted to go, and he told me that he felt I could do it. And as a testament to him and to the first sergeants. That's where I ended up going. So in 2003, I ended up going to the Naval Academy. As far as my relationship with God, I'd stopped just going to church. And really, because I was frustrated with what I saw in church. Mainly, it was just, I'll be quite honest, a lot of older women who would just pray the rosary beads. Didn't see a whole lot of men around. You see them, but they were very passive, just kind of silent, sitting in the pews. My dad had not gone to church. I would say almost all the men in my family weren't, active churchgoers. My mom was very faithful, devout woman of the Catholic faith, and I respect to this day, I respect her faith, and she's really grown, have a strong personal relationship with Christ. But I was just glad to get off and do my thing in college, but I still had this thought, there's something missing. And so the first 2 years I struggled with it. I struggled with what it meant to kill somebody in combat, but I ended up eventually becoming a Christian, joined the military, getting to be, Marine Corps officer, and I'm able to have this blend where I felt like God called me to being in service to our country, to being, serving primarily right now in the Marine Corps and across the branches, and also really fusing my newfound faith that I would find.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I do want to get into your testimony, but I want to back up a little bit to something that you just said in your answer a moment ago. I guess the general feeling that your family had about military service, and then of course, here you are, you decide to join the military. So I'm just curious, did that create any sort of friction between you guys? How did your family take the news when you probably announced to them at some point during high school, hey, I'm going to sign up to be a Marine?
It's a great question. So my first 2 years being at the Naval Academy, in high school, he knew I was in JROTC. My dad was supportive, my mom's supportive of it, but my dad, I think, was just hoping that it was a phase, I would just grow out of it. But something did change in my father, especially. 9/11 happened. And I remember it changed a lot for my generation. So of the millennials that we were just in high school at the time who watched this go down, we were steeled with resolve. We want to do something about this. And many of my friends who were in Marine JROTC ended up enlisting in the Marine Corps or other services, and they went downrange, served the country. One of my friends, he was later died from wounds. I had another friend I remember seeing would die. He wouldn't die. He was injured in Fallujah in 2004. But with my father especially, I remember sitting down at the table with him, and he said, son, I could see that the military needs smart guys like you, and I think if things had been different for me, I would join the military now. I think that was the turning point in our relationship and about me joining the military. And then when I was 18 and I had finally, got a step to the Naval Academy, I remember going to his bedroom talking about it. He's like, son, I've always said I'd support my kids, whatever they want to do. And if this is what you want to do, I support it. And then time flies, now it's about ready for graduation. My father, my mother come down for my senior time. And I remember my dad was talking to my friend Tim Conaway, and Tim at the time was trying to be a Navy SEAL and he got selected for that. And he was telling that to my father, and my dad turns to me, he's like, Chris, what did you service select? And I said, Marine Corps Ground. He just shook his head. But later at commissioning, he told me how proud he was of me, and he ended up saying that he was, really just nervous and scared. And my parents, they always were nervous whenever I go overseas, but my family as a whole became to see this idea of the military as a noble profession. And it's funny now, the tables have turned so much. My dad is like, oh, you should stay in the military, you're doing great. He's really interested in what I do. So
that's really good to hear. I'm sure that certainly helps to, as you're going through your career, know that you've got some level of support from your family. Eventually, I want to get into a discussion maybe about the integration of faith and your military career and what that's looked like for you. But I think first we need to start with your testimony. How did you become a believer?
Yeah, so my first couple of years at the Naval Academy, I had this thought that I was just done with what I saw as religious church life. It was very boring. It didn't really do much for me. The priest at the time that I worked with, I would basically look at him as like a modern day Pharisee. He was more concerned with where I put the cup and chalice on the altar than really helping us understand how do we live our faith out in daily life. Nobody had ever taught that to me. But something, and I said before, the men in my family, especially, and really a lot of people in my family, were not actively going to church. We grew up in an Irish Catholic and my mom's side is Portuguese Catholic type family. So religion was part of our lives in the sense that, especially the older generation grew up going to church. I was baptized. It was part of your thing. But most people did not go to church on an active level, except for my grandmother and my mom. And as a kids, we went to church and my dad was like, oh, that's kind of good. You should do that, right? But going to the Naval Academy first 2 years, I started meeting people who were really serious about their faith. And that really was interesting to me. And then my sophomore year, beginning of that summer, I was part of summer seminar detail. And I was invited to a Bible study by other midshipmen, basically. And they were all Christians. And there was something unique about them. I saw something different. and couldn't put quite something on it. And then through my sophomore year, started attending Protestant Chapel Sunday School. I figured I'd give that a shot. My dad always said he'd make a good Protestant among Catholics. And so I was like, okay, like I'm going to check this out. And I started realizing that there came a point where what I had learned as a kid growing up was not going to matter anymore. That I was on my own as an adult, and especially going in the military at 22, 23 years old, I'm going to be downrange leading the Marines, which I ended up getting to do in combat. But I'm going to have to make this life for myself, and I got to make some decisions. And one of the decisions I had to make was, what am I going to do about this question of God? And I get to the end of my sophomore year, and one of the things I really struggled with was this idea of, could I like take human life? Is that a lawful, moral thing in the eyes of God? I was in a sophomore class, second semester, and Vice Admiral Haskin retired. He was a Navy officer who was teaching ethics, and he had talked about this idea of divine command theory. We were talking about the story of Abraham, almost killing his son. And really something I took away from that class was this idea, I really care about what God has to say about my profession, especially because of the gravity of what I'm about to do, to either potentially die or to potentially have to take life. And so I had to figure that out. And I ended up, a friend of mine in my company, Cassisi Harris, he was with OCF at the time, and I was just learning about a little bit what OCF was. I said, Cassisi, do you know a Marine officer I could talk to who was in OCF? And he said, yeah, I know Craig Clemens. I was like, all right. So I reached out to Craig. He had just come in as a company officer. We sat down at Smoke Hall in 2005, the Naval Academy, about May timeframe. And I just asked him, I was like, all right, sir, I know you've come in from Iraq. You've been downrange. Talk to me about this issue. He honestly didn't talk to me about that issue as much as he said, he listened to me talk about my faith background and essentially said, Chris, I think the biggest issue here is I don't think you have a real relationship with Christ. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And we walked through what that meant. And he was right in the sense I was really just trying to be like this good person, following these principles, but I had never truly committed my life to Christ. Like I had a lot of head knowledge, and he made this comment about there's a big difference of 12 inches between our head and our heart. And I remember thinking at that moment, he also mentioned there was a Navy officer who just passed away running a PRT, and he was like, I don't know where he's at. And I really was recognizing this idea of eternity. I all of a sudden just knew in my heart, like I believe that I'm going to live for eternity. I'm either going to go to heaven or hell, and I want to go to heaven. And I just believed that Jesus was the answer. Like, I didn't know everything at the time, but I also knew something in my heart too. And so I think looking back with the Holy Spirit was that it was not about feelings. It was about a complete decision to turn my whole life over to God and follow him, whatever that meant, whatever cost. I had to do it. And so at that moment, I just remember praying with him in my heart. I was like, all right, I'm ready to follow Jesus. I'm serious about this. And really the next few weeks, there was a change. And I remember reading this book by Joshua Harris. It was about sex is not the problem, lust is. And I had really a struggle with lustful temptations. I had addiction to pornography at one point. And I remember just, thinking I can't break this chain on my own. Every time I gave it up, it just would come back. But then I remember I could pray to God for help. And I remember the moment I prayed to God for help to overcome temptation, and was like I had this strength to overcome it. And that's when I knew that God was real. I also remember asking God if I could feel his love, and I felt it. And once those two things happened, I experienced God's power over sin, and I experienced his love. There was no turning back. God was real. And then as I went home to Connecticut, I remember having this thought, and it was probably before and after that I realized like God was calling me. I remember going to dance clubs and doing some things that are not so good with girls, and like I could just feel like the Lord speaking to me, and I didn't know how you could tell that was God, but I just knew that I had to follow him. Didn't matter what my family thought, didn't matter what anybody, like God's like, I'm calling you. And so that was really the turning point in my life. And really from there, I should back up for a moment. There was a woman, Rosa Martinez, who was praying for me for many years, 5 years actually, when she met me in 15. And I believe that was a part of it. But also at this church service that she had helped me locate this church, the pastor was talking about going into your promised land and essentially deciding this is what I'm going to do as a man. Where's your life going to go? And I remember thinking, I don't want to be like the Israelites wander around the wilderness. I want to follow what God has for me. And I asked God, what do you have for me? And he says, I want you to sign your commitment papers. I said, okay. And so I signed my commitment papers, got off in the military, and I'm meeting the guy, Kurt Parsons, who ended up really discipling me. He was a Navy lieutenant at the time and one of the company officers. And that would launch me on a trajectory of really God leading me in terms of my military career, but also leading me on a path where I knew that I was called to be a light for him inside the military.
I'd like to continue, I guess, some of the thoughts that you were starting to pull out of that answer. I guess we'll refer to it as an integration of faith and your profession. So it sounds like at least for a part of your military career that you've been a believer. And I'm trying to think of how really to ask this question. So I'll frame it in this way. What's been the most difficult part of living out that dual calling of military service and also the Christ-like calling of a believer?
I think it's this reality that when you and this is not just for people in the military, I think it's any profession, but the military, certainly you're part of the U.S. government. And in our culture today, especially, there is this idea from a political correct standpoint that when it comes to sharing your faith, people don't want you to share your faith because they feel it's something very private. And if you're talking to somebody about your faith, then you're pushing it on somebody. And especially in terms of the military, it could almost seem like you just got to go along with the crowd and do whatever the crowd's doing, because if you're going against it, you're not going to be good. In fact, I remember when I was a second lieutenant, I was about 22 years old, going through the basic school, and I'm sitting in this crowd of other lieutenants. We were just getting ready to do a live fire attack. And one of the guys was telling a dirty joke, and I didn't laugh at it because I didn't find it appropriate, trying to be obedient to what the Lord is calling me to do. And he looked at me directly, and he's like, Reardon, if you can't learn to laugh at a dirty joke, you're not going to cuss and all this stuff, like, you're never going to fit inside of like a infantry battalion. You're never going to fit inside of an aviation unit. And there was this temptation at that moment to just be like, man, maybe he's right. If I'm really going to be successful in the Marine Corps, like, I got to be like everybody else. I got to be like the world, basically. Because there's just no way to be a Christian from what I thought to be and do this. And I also just knew at that moment that that was really not from God. And I made a decision, though, at that moment. I was like, Lord, I don't know what you have for me, but like, I know you have something big, and I'm going to do things your way. I'm not going to do things the world's way. I'm going to honor my profession. And it was that crux of those issues of balancing my roles as a government leader. And we believe in the freedom of religion. It's for everybody. And so as a Christian, you believe that other people could believe as they're going to believe. And especially in the military, we live in a pluralistic organization, and I'm okay with that. But I've also learned and grown to recognize, like, hey, I have a voice too, and I have a right to my faith as a Christian. And it's okay to talk about it. And especially it's okay to live it out. And even if that doesn't look well, and maybe people think I'm funny or whatever, I got over it, and I learned how to get better at that to actually make an impact.
What exactly has that look like in terms of the adversity or the perseverance or just that struggle between faith and wanting to fit in? How have you worked through that?
Yeah, well, it started, like I said, first a conviction is that 1 Peter 3:15 says, set aside the Messiah as Lord in your heart. You have to determine that whatever you're going to do, you're going to serve God. Step number one, because if you don't make that decision, the world will always blow you off course. Now, I follow that up right after that with step number 2. You have to be flexible, and you have to understand your culture. You have to understand where you fall, like where you're at in your rank, what can you do, what can't do. So you have to study your balance. I found that as I was growing up as a Christian, one of the things that was lacking, especially in the Christian leaders, especially the ones who were older, they grew up in a time where the Judeo-Christian ethic and, more people were just going to church. So it seems more acceptable. Now, I'm not saying that things weren't easy for them either, but I was growing up in a culture where things were rapidly changing. A lot of people are not following God. We saw a lot of different immorality happen in our country. We still do, right? And I was going to have to figure out, how was I going to be like a palm tree? So you have to have your roots in God, but you got to be able to sway with the breeze. If you're just an oak tree, the wind will blow you over and knock you over. At the same time, if you're not rooted in the Lord at all, you're going to blow away as well too. So it's a very tight balance. So practically speaking, let's talk about evangelism for a moment versus proselytization. Proselytization is not allowed in the military, but something got defined, I think it was 2013, 2014, can't remember the exact year. But basically at one point the military, I think it was the Air Force actually, was going to make a policy whereas as an officer or a chaplain, if you shared your faith with a junior person, then you could be court-martialed. Congress took a look at that, like, whoa, what is going on here? And for the first time, the military defined that, proselytization was basically forcing somebody to listen to your faith. And so, we're actively using our rank, our authority. And it's like, so for example, I'm a major, and if I pull in, somebody junior me, and I say, hey, I want to just talk to you about Jesus, and they feel like they have to sit there and listen, well, that's wrong. But if I'm just having a conversation with somebody, and it comes up as a matter of conversation, and they don't feel coerced or threatened, then that's okay. And one of the things the Lord put in my heart as a young man, I watched another friend of mine, he was a civilian, but he would go out in the streets just talking to people, sharing tracts and whatnot, and I couldn't do it. And the Lord just put in me, he's like, I'm going to teach you, Chris, how to share your faith through relationships. And I was very fortunate that I had mentors who had taught me that as well. And so I learned the importance of living out my job with a spirit of excellence, doing the job to the best I possibly could, building rapport with people, learning them, being their friend, serving my leaders just as God called me to do. And as I built that as my primary platform, the next thing I learned to do was, and especially in the later years to more recent, was I had to learn to speak institutionally. What I mean by that is, the military culture cares about a few different things. So for example, I talked before about this idea of killing in battle or dying in battle. There's some really core issues of life that everybody wrestles with. Doesn't matter whether you're Christian or not. And as a Christian, we have some unique answers to that. And if you could speak into that with people, then you have the ability to be heard. And so that was something I started being able to understand and grasp how I was going to basically not just use Christian churches, but speak biblical truth, sometimes without even sharing chapter verse. Somebody asked me a question, hey, what do you believe about this? And I said, well, I believe this. Well, I'm actually speaking a biblical principle. I just didn't say it came from John chapter 4. And they're like, oh, that's really interesting. We have a dialogue, right? Or if we're going to talk about the Bible, I actually learned the history about the Bible. How did the Bible come together? So we have intellectual conversations kind of into apologetics. And most recently, I've learned this idea of the command religious program. And so from an institutional standpoint in the military, you're able to basically have this free exercise of religious faith, and the chaplain's the overseer of it in a unit. And if you work with the chaplain and come alongside him or her, you could literally actually exercise Christian influence and talk about what the Bible says in relation to your jobs. And so I actually learned how to strategize in taking the CRP, if you will, and building into everyday command culture from a tactical training standpoint. I did it through fitness and helping chaplains understand that. To them, a lot of them, the CRP is just like, hey, invite people to a church service or invite people to Bible study, which a lot of people weren't going to. I say, hey, let's flip the model on this and actually operationalize in a sense where it's actually going to impact unit culture and mission.
Yeah, and that's really good. So communicating biblical truths without being too churchy. I'm using the word churchy, if that's even a word. And yeah, you're right. Today, it's such a polarizing climate compared to maybe people that served 20, 30, 40 years before your service. So, I mean, communicating those truths, obviously it requires a lot of wisdom, a lot of situational awareness. And you started to go into something. I want you to circle back to it. Give me an example of a biblical truth that you have communicated to someone without actually, as you said, quoting verse and chapter.
In a day-to-day lifestyle standpoint, let's talk about leadership. Even the term servant leadership, that's actually taken a lot of positive connotation in just regular secular culture today. And so Jesus talks about, don't be like the Gentiles who lord it over others, but instead the greatest among you must serve the least. When I look at my leadership style, one of the Bibles that I was given when I was at TBS by one of my female lieutenant friends, Bridget, I didn't read it until after I got back from my first deployment, but it was a John Maxwell leadership Bible. It had so many of these principles. And one of the things I learned was this idea of influencing my leaders, influencing my peers, influencing my junior leaders. And so as I started learning those principles and understanding where they came from in the Bible, I was able to start articulating those principles and live it out. Most importantly, you have to live it first. When people see that and then they ask you, well, why do you do that? Well, I believe in this principle that I'm not here to lord over people. I'm here to help and serve and to guide the vision. Well, people are like, wow, that's really interesting. That's just a practical day-to-day matter. But let's say on another issue, let's say it's killing versus murder. Okay. One of the things that I recently was able to do is there's a book out there by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, who's actually a Christian, by the way. But he wrote two books, actually On Killing and On Combat, is two most famous books that at one point were on the Commandant's reading list. I'm not sure if they're still on there. But I read through On Combat, and one of the chapters, it talks about this idea of the Judeo-Christian view of killing. And most people in America have this thought that it says thou shalt not kill. But then you go in the police, you go in the military, and one of your jobs is to kill people, right? If they break the law or they're coming against your country. So how do you deal with this? I learned to start being able to articulate that difference. And I would say, I actually put together a video on this where I talk through hey, from the Old Testament standpoint, this is what this means. You have this idea of government authority. There's legitimacy in what you're doing because you're defending other people versus murder, where I just don't like somebody or they just made me upset and now I'm going to kill them. Well, that's murder. And being able to articulate that to people, whether they're Christian or not, is important. In fact, one of my friends, Chaplain Holcomb, he's a Navy captain now, but when he was a lieutenant in 2003, he was with a tank battalion out of Camp Pendleton, and they had to deal with this issue. And what he did at the time was he used the movie Saving Private Ryan, and he walked them through the movie and basically said, all right, there was two different scenes. One's where they were killing people in the D-Day invasion, and all the way to where you get these soldiers, they killed unarmed prisoners, or these guys Germans are surrendering. They killed them. They said, oh, we don't know what you're saying, and they let go. And the chaplain asked these Marines, who killed and who murdered? And he was able to use movie scenes and things like that to articulate these principles.
So, Chris, one of the things that I know in chatting offline is that you're involved with this. Is it considered a business or a ministry called Freedom Fitness America?
Yeah, it's a nonprofit organization, but one of the ways that we want to be able to raise money long run is to do virtual fitness training and bring it to civilians. Right now, I'm just focusing in on just raising money through donations and through outreach to the military. But down the road, there's going to be a business aspect to it as well to raise funds.
So up to this point, we've talked about this dual calling of your faith and then your military profession. And I'm curious then, how does Freedom Fitness America fit in? Why is it important to you? Why was it started and that sort of thing?
Yeah, FFA was started, so I got to go back to almost about 2015, 2016. In 2015, I was part of an event called The Crucible, and I was working with the Rock Church in San Diego, and the leader of the ministry at the time, Darlene Menken, she had asked me to put together a men's retreat for military members. And I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do. Well, from there, it ended up being like this larger event up at Camp Pendleton. Had about 100 people show up. I was kind of disappointed. I wanted more people to show, but that became a launching pad for this idea of outdoor adventure. Now, before that, I was doing fitness-related things, and I was into CrossFit, for example. I was actually part of like a Christian CrossFit gym in 2014, 2015. And then in 2016, there was a couple things that happened the same year. One was I had been a part of an organization called Faith RX. I think you're familiar with it, but like Faith RX is a Christian organization that reaches the CrossFit community and the fitness community in general, started by my friend Becky Koselman and her friend James Koselman. Now, Becky ended up passing away, I think 2 years ago now, I believe. She was, a great sister in Christ to me. She was a military spouse for 20 years. And so I really loved their idea of how they were tying in fitness and faith. And that was something very intriguing to me. I never really thought about that. So that was step one. I was seeing this. I was also part of this idea of microsites at the Rock Church, which is basically like live streaming services inside different places. So we live stream these church services inside different areas. Like, for example, we basically had this microsite in a gym. So that was going on, and then I was doing this thing called The Crucible. This was a bit like 2015, 2016. Well, in 2016, I'm purchasing a fitness gym in San Diego. It's called Lift Life Results. Thinking, okay, I'm going to purchase this gym. It's going to be this wonderful thing where I'm going to do ministry, make money. Well, the gym failed pretty miserably. I actually ended up filing Chapter 7 bankruptcy. It was a very dark time in my life. But during that moment, I ended up going to an OCF retreat. And while I was there, I heard God speak the words Freedom Fitness into my spirit. And so as he spoke those things into my spirit, I believe that, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Well, also during that same year, I was speaking to a businessman. He was a former Marine, and he had talked about this idea of, he's like, Chris, I see you one day putting together an organization that's going to be like building Tough Mudder-like events. It's going to be something like CrossFit, but you're going to do ministry with it, and you're going to be like I'll just use the terms he used, like almost like a military version like Billy Graham. I was like, whoa. And I knew the Holy Spirit was speaking through him at that time. And he wasn't the first person who said something like this to me. My friend Joey, he was a National Guard chaplain at the time. And he had this kind of thought too, as he was watching The Crucible. He was part of what I was doing at CrossFit Diet and was this Christian CrossFit gym. And so the Lord was really speaking to me on this. So then in 2017, as I finalized in the Chapter 7 bankruptcy, my wife said something to me. She's like, Chris, you're going to be fine going through his bankruptcy, but he's going to want something from you afterwards. And I didn't know what that meant, but I remember right after I got cleared all the debts, because all business related, I was able to have this fresh new start. But I felt this impression in my spirit that God wanted me to do this Tough Mudder Christian event on East Miramar. I didn't know what that looked like. It was about April of 2017. I was getting ready to leave to New Orleans in 2 months. And so I was like, I was on duty at the time. I was like, I don't know what to do. And he's like, just make it happen, Marine. That's how I felt. And so we did, and it started what's called the Freedom Defense Challenge. We had about 50 people show up. My friend Phil Downer spoke. We had both a secular message from Phil, and then we also did a Christian message under the CRP. It was phenomenal, right? And it was like the launch of what this would look like. And then as I go out to New Orleans, I still start pioneering this idea of like, almost like having a Faith RX model, but flipping the script to really work with the military community. And so over the next 3 years, I started really beta testing what this looked like at my own command in New Orleans, headquarters battalion. And we saw this huge increase of spiritual fitness. And the way we measured that was the chaplain told me we had about an 80% drop in sexual assaults and suicide ideations as we're having both these secular and Christian messages that are tied into fitness. I was working with small unit leaders. We did an outdoor adventure event. We had about 180 Marines show up. It was great. This was right before COVID hit. And I knew at some point I had to start a nonprofit because being under a certain command, every time I moved from command, it would just die. But if I had a nonprofit organization, now I had something to come from to help other units out with, and I could build a group from that. And I could also do the practical aspect of raising money, actually having a legal status with the military. We call it non-federal entity when you look at joint ethics regulations. So it's not just Chris Reardon anymore. There's actually a legal business structure behind it. And so we really still do that today, where we have outdoor adventure events, which we haven't done a lot because of COVID. My hope is in 2022, we're going to be doing those. But we have been doing a fitness thing. We've pioneered a virtual fitness model. We're able to tie these various, what I call total fitness discussions with fitness.
There are several threads I'd like to pull together. The dual calling, the integration of faith and profession, what you're doing with FFA and so forth. I feel like maybe there's a broader context for listeners, meaning not everyone will be called to start something like FFA. So what's the broader message or the bigger takeaway for those folks?
I think the bigger message I would like to take away, especially most of OCF, is everyday military officers. Now enlisted, I know that's a part of OCS. Most people are not chaplains. Most people are not pastors. You have a day job of serving your country. And I'm really speaking to like active duty reserves. I recognize that part of OCF is also family members. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But basically, this idea of what I really want as a broader message is that while you're living in the institution, that is your mission field. You're going to have most of your impact during your work life. And yet the struggle is, hey, you're doing your job and you're trying to be this light for God. What can you do to actually make a bigger difference? And so one of the things, and I really question that as well, especially after I got married, one of the things that became very apparent to me is when I was a single guy, so I got married right before I turned 32 years old. So between the time I was 20 when I gave my life to Christ at 32, I had my profession, I was doing relationship evangelism because I was on the inside of the force, but also I did a lot of work in nonprofits and parachurch ministries and whatnot in the evenings. But then I got married and I'm like, oh, and I got this family in the evenings. Now, God, what do I do? Well, I started realizing I could use my lunch breaks to still do ministry. I could use early morning time frames, and I could start having more of an impact by working with chaplains and commanders. And so the thing that I would want as a takeaway is think strategically about how you're going to make your unit better from a character development standpoint. So character matters to the military because we have to do very difficult things and yet do it in a way with excellence. There's there's a lot of issues of symptoms, if you will, whether it be domestic violence, sexual assaults, people doing unethical things in combat. And these are things that military leaders care about. Well, as Christians, we could actually speak into that. We don't have to necessarily proselytize to do that, but we could take biblical principles, align it with what the institution says. So for example, in the Marine Corps, our core values along with the Navy is honor, courage, commitment. Well, if I understand what those principles are, I take a look at what the leadership curriculum's looking like, and I say, okay, I have this Christian faith, these things align. Well, why don't I really emphasize and articulate what these values mean and work to really make my unit, whatever that is, a battalion, squadron, command headquarters, better, and think practically what that looks like. So for me, what I did was I recognized fitness was the biggest thing that people did outside of eating in terms of the military. If I could tie in fitness to bring people together and then tie in relevant content, I could start shaping the culture. And as I said before, that culture actually mattered. When we had such a major drop in sexual assaults and suicide ideations, military leaders take notice of that. And they're like, oh yeah, keep doing what you're doing because it's making a difference. And so as you're doing that, and then I'm working with chaplains. Okay, I know in OCF we're big on coming alongside chaplains. They really love me because having somebody who's able to get around the unit and figure things out, understand logistics, that really made a difference, right? So whatever that looks like, if you're on active duty, you need to think creatively, like how do I use my talents, my time, my treasure, my position to make an impact? That doesn't mean you have to force your faith on people, but you can do something to make the environment better. And then for those who are family members, I'm in military housing right now, and there's a lot of spouses out there where they're staying home or they're working, they have kids. You're gonna see these people at the playgrounds, you're gonna see them in groups. What are you gonna do to build relationships with them? Daily life. That's really where ministry happens. It's not in church on Sunday is great or going to your Bible study is great, but most of this is gonna happen during everyday life. And that's what, if there was a message I wanted to pass on to people, is like think strategically what you're gonna do to do that in an appropriate manner.
Yeah, it's a great message. And as we've talked about, as you've unpacked, it's this idea of communicating biblical truths without being too churchy. And so, Chris, as we're nearing the end of our time together, I want to get into the weeds a little bit more with Freedom Fitness of America. I want to give you a chance just to talk a little bit more about that. Specifically, how does it work? Who is it for? And where can folks find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So We say our mission is to train military professionals to be fit for the fight in life, which means to be physically, mentally, and spiritually prepared for the violence of combat and tackling obstacles in everyday life. Our values are fitness, faith, family, finance, and freedom. So to unpack that, our modality of training centers around physical fitness, whether that be almost like a CrossFit type. We don't say we do CrossFit, we do functional fitness training, but it just kind of gives people what that looks like. Another one of our values is faith. So that means a couple things. It means we really believe in the development of mental health, but we also believe in the development of the spirit, which is the foundation of character and ultimate resiliency and resolve in somebody. And as a part of that, we support the command religious program of units from a Christian faith standpoint. In other words, all of our leaders on our leadership team are all Christians. They all serve in the military. Most are active duty. One's a reserve officer. So we have this worldview, if you will, of understanding how our Christian faith fits in the bigger picture. And so we're able to come up with different video content that's going to support, a chaplain's ability and a unit leader's ability to support that command and religious program. Then when you talk about family, so we really believe in two sides of the family. One is the people you go to war with, if you will, like your unit, your relationships, but also your everyday family. Now, if you're single, you're not married to have kids, that's great. You still have family, brothers, sisters, mom, dad. So we want to be able to enhance those relationships. We also want to enhance marriages and kids through proper education. Finance, about financial health. And then freedom is really talk about civic influence and leadership. And really, from a military standpoint, people really look up to the military, but how are you going to make your unit, your community, and ultimately your nation better? So those are the values we focus on in terms of our content. Now, in practical service, we have a concept called the Freedom Box. And the Freedom Box is nothing more than basically a bunch of guys and gals, military unit getting together, they work out on their own, and they're going to do a video message. Now, we actually practically deliver those videos through our YouTube channel, Shoot, Move, Communicate. And so people could just basically subscribe to our channel, they could pick the video content, and they're able to just do work on their own. That's what we call the Freedom Box Basic. They typically do that once a week. Then we have the Freedom Nation, and that's where we have a virtual fitness. And that's where basically people will come into our workouts through an internet connection from their cell phone or computer, so they could get either video on demand or be live. And I'm actually leading those workouts right out of my garage. So I'm leading them through a physical fitness session that's designed for getting you in shape for your job. But also, we're going to tie in different inspirational content along the values I mentioned before. Then we have the Freedom Box Advanced. This is where we actually come alongside unit leaders, and we also come alongside chaplains, where we take that, where I said before, that Freedom Box Basic model, but now we make it customizable to your unit. And ideally, it's something where we take our breadth of video content and we fit it towards what is going to help your unit out best, whether it be you're getting ready to deploy or you're coming back from deployment, whatever that looks like, but we work with you to do it. But we basically, with those three models, the Freedom Nation being almost like a done-for-you model, we also invite civilians to come in who we hope to be able to donate money right now. Eventually, we'll probably get to a business model where they subscribe to our workouts, and that funds our ability to hire part-time coaches and also travel to military units to give that training. So those are our three basic, if you will, like a discipleship model. Then we have our outdoor adventure events. One is called the Freedom Assault Course. This is basically where we train a military unit how to tie in tactical training and outdoor adventure with video-based content. And it's like a Tough Mudder or Spartan Race type challenge. So that's the Freedom Assault Course. And then the Freedom Crucibles, we also allow civilians to come into that. So we would take a unit who's doing that Freedom Assault Course model, and we teach them how to basically bring in civilians as well. So now we get a broader context of the military and civilian community coming together to do something like military-like. Now, checking us out, if you go to freedomfitnessamerica.org, that's our basic website, you'll see what our leadership team looks like, what our values are about, our content. Also, our virtual training, you go to Moxie, MOXIE.X-ray Yankee Zulu, so XYZ /Freedom Nation. And you could just go ahead and reserve a fitness class. I teach them mainly at 6 a.m. in the morning, Pacific Standard Time, Monday through Friday. And eventually next year, I'm going to be launching something called Tactical Dad. It's a virtual fitness class with my son, who's almost 4 years old, for other military dads to basically do certain workout together with your kid, but also talk through some life skills to really be a better parent. So those are our basic services and programming. Also, I put out there our YouTube channel is the fastest way people are finding us right now. If you just actually search in Shoot, Move, Communicate, those words spaced out on YouTube, you'll find us and you subscribe to our channel. And that's where all our video content's at. On Memorial Day 2022, we're going to look to do a Murph challenge. So Murph, people don't know what that is, from the CrossFit community, we call it Hero Workout of the Day. Essentially, it's a mile run followed by 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 air squats, another mile run. And then we're going to be doing that virtually, and we want to bring people from around the country. And really what I'm looking for is, like, anybody who's listening to this podcast, if you're in a military unit, you want to participate in that, we'd love to work with you to get your unit to participate in it. We also want to bring in civilians virtually to participate in this as well. So we're looking for people to help us really get that word out. And then we want to tie in what's called the surrender movie. So my friend Damon Freeman, he's a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, combat tactical controller, came up with this movie called Surrender Only One Movie. And it's a film where basically the first 40 minutes is secular in content. The last 20 minutes is the Christian testimonies of special forces operators talking about combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we basically want to tie this film in with the workout so that we're able to have people to work out, build camaraderie on Memorial Day, but also talk about how Christian faith is applicable to dealing with the issues that military people deal with. So it's a way for us to just get that message out to people using fitness. And it's also a way for people, if they want to donate to what we're doing, they could donate online. So we're basically looking for people to come alongside of us and either just participate virtually in that workout or to actually help lead, workout on their own.
Yeah, and for everybody listening to the show, be sure to check out the show notes. I'm going to provide all the links, everything that Chris talked about today, so that you can find out more about Chris, about the events that he mentioned, and also more about Freedom Fitness America. Chris, I really appreciate your time today, for sharing your story and your insights, and for learning more about Freedom Fitness America. Thanks so much for being on the show.
I appreciate it, Josh. I appreciate having me on the show, and I appreciate everything OCF's doing, and just, coming alongside you guys to support you with stuff like this.
OCF Crosspoint is a production of Officers Christian Fellowship. For more information about OCF, check us out online at ocfusa.org or find us on Facebook and Instagram at OCFUSA. This episode was hosted and produced by me, Josh Jackson. Audio cleanup and repair was done by Michael Jerry of Mighty Productions. If you have an idea for a guest, topic, or story that you think should be considered on a future episode, send an email to podcast@ocfusa.org. Thanks for listening, and be sure to join us for the next episode of OCF Crosspoint.